Hello everyone, this is part 21 of What If Naruto Was a Prodigy and in the Anbu, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Kanoshi was a large city that had been built on one of the Great Plains of the Land of Fire. A large river, drawing water all the way from the mountain ranges of the Land of Earth, flowed down from the northwest, and it cut close to the city, bringing with it the trade of the Western nations. Small towns had been built around the river, supporting the burgeoning mercantile economy, and usually a constant trickle of carts and carriages would travel to and from the river docks, bringing in supplies and passengers. Now, the carts and carriages had stopped. The twinkling stores were blotted out by huge plumes of smoke that rose from the Land of Fire's capital city and the outlying towns, and large fires raged uncontrolled. A shimmering barrier of dark purple enclosed Kanoshi itself, trapping in the occupants of the city as the army of the revolutionary Kazuma began its attack. From the vantage point several kilometers away, at the edge of the tree line of the nearest forest, the Black Ops operatives codenamed Team Spark crouched at the very top of the foliage of the trees. They all wore dark robes and blank silver masks. Their leader, designated Spark Eye, held a pair of binoculars and he watched the beginning of the Land of Fire's civil war with the quiet sense of achievement. It had been a difficult mission. Team Spark had had the support of several other squads at the very beginning of the operation, but that support had dwindled as Konoha had increased its patrols and tightened its internal security. The other teams had returned back to the village, leaving Team Spark behind in the deep recesses of the Land of Fire's forests to fend for themselves. It had been hard avoiding patrols, gathering supplies from nearby drop points and continuing to run their operations. Much of their success was due to one of the freelancers that Kazuma had hired. Team Spark had been initially dubious of the orange-masked man, and even Spark IV, their best sensor, hadn't been able to get a read upon them. Nonetheless, the man's strange techniques and unique knowledge had allowed Team Spark to travel around Konoha unheeded. The freelancer had also had contacts deep within the logistical chain of command, and as such they had been able to implement several successful false flag operations incriminating Sarutobi's latest protégé. Kazuma was mad, and his idea of a Jinchuriki army was just as bad. That didn't really matter to Spark Eye. His orders had never included the need for Kazuma to win, so long as the revolution weakened the Land of Fire and Konoha as a whole. Spark Eye's hands flashed, twisting into a silent non-verbal code that only he and his team knew of. Status on Alpha and Bravo. Spark IV answered. Bravo has moved away from priority target, seeking secondary target 3. He paused, tilting his head in the air. His loose brown hair ruffled in the wind behind his mask. Location of Alpha remains unknown. Spark 3 answered that for them, her hands moving rapidly. Sentry indicates presence of Alpha in Sector S4G of City. Verifying, she paused, angling one of her remote spies in for a closer look. Chakra presence confirmed, visual presence confirmed, olfactory presence confirmed, Alpha has left priority target. Spark Eye nodded in confirmation. Begin the operation, he signed. On the tree branch above them, Spark V clapped his hands in a seal. With Spark 2 and Spark V maintaining a very sophisticated barrier technique, only the members of the Black Ops team could feel the sudden surge of chakra that flowed through the air. Spark V didn't make a sound, but the strain on his body was nonetheless quite visible. He stood in that position for a few moments and then nodded. Next to him, the blank mask Spark 3 signed on her brother's behalf. Infiltration complete. The palace has been breached. Gas canisters deployed, the bunker has been neutralized, no life signs. Confirm, Spark Eye ordered. The two summoners were silent for at least a minute. Then, Spark V shook his head silently, and Spark Eye's fingers flashed. Negative priority target missing. Spark Eye nodded calmly. Locate target, search for multiple life signs in a small area, confirm locations. The two operatives did so, and for the next few minutes Spark Eye watched the city burn. The faint sounds of screaming and yelling rose up into the air, but the man was unaffected. He idly noted a series of flashes explosive tags, Class 3, clustered within 1 meter radius near the south gate. The third Hokage was undoubtedly on the move and it wouldn't take the god of all shinobi to scatter his enemies to the wind and bring down that barrier. When that happened, Spark Eye and his team were not going to be there. Contact, clustered life forms detected, body heat, increased level of humidity and carbon dioxide first floor, 2 shinobi present, sash of the 12 guardians confirmed. Begin the operation infiltrate and assassinate. Understood assuming direct control. Spark Eye watched as Spark 3 and Spark V took control of the tiny rodent summons. They would undoubtedly be sneaking up on the 2 guardians, waiting for a chance to leap at them and inject them with a cocktail of drugs, hormones, several powerful mind-altering substances and a dose of chakra. It would be enough for the 2 Black Ops shinobi to influence and control the actions of the guardians from afar, entering the room where their priority target waited and terminating him in a matter of moments. Direct control assumed, moving to terminate. Both Spark 3 and V radiated a sense of intense concentration, their hands twisted up into the snake hand seal. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, Spark V jerked back and let out an audible groan, his head snapping back. He stumbled, losing his place on the branch, and began to fall, but Spark IV jumped from her branch and snatched him from the air. Spark 3 let out a little shriek a second later and collapsed, leaning against the trunk of the tree, panting harshly. Report, Spark Eye's hands flashed. Mission failure, Alpha present in the room, proxies terminated, Spark 3 managed to report with trembling fingers. The backlash of the aborted technique was significant enough that Spark Eye could see a trickle of blood oozing out of Spark V's ears. He nodded, emotionless, and raised his hand to signal his team to withdraw. They had failed in their chance to eliminate the Fire Lord, but it had merely been an attack of opportunity, and not a requirement. His superiors would be pleased enough to hear that the Land of Fire's capital was in flames and there was always a chance that Kazuma could win, however small that it was. Then a sudden burst of red light flashed in the corner of his eye, and he jerked his head back to the city. A crimson light was glowing at the base of the Fire Palace, the light pulsing ominously. There was a cold feeling in the air, and something heavy settled down upon them. Spark Eye was legitimately surprised at the sheer power he could feel, and it was something that he had only felt once before when Kazuma had demonstrated the power of his Tier 1 weapons. The other man had always been assured of the next weapon, the Tier 2, and Spark Eye could see why. How had the man managed to create such a powerful Jinchuriki? This changed thing, a Tier 1 weapon had been decided by his superiors to be insignificant. The level of power that the Tier 2 weapon was displaying, however, was immense. Should such a thing be replicated? Spark Eye took a deep breath and made a field decision. Spark Eye's hands flashed. New priority orders, secure rebel leader and extract to home village for debriefing, 2 and Vi, continue Ma. He was cut off by a flash of bright light and a thunderous boom that echoed around them. A large explosion had just gone off at the base of the Fire Palace, and for a moment the crimson presence of the Tier 2 disappeared underneath the rising ball of flame. Then, it reappeared and the presence came off even stronger than before. For a moment, nothing happened, and then there was a second presence just as powerful as the first. Spark Eye belayed his orders, waving his hand and cancelling his message. Konoha had just deployed the Jinchuriki to counter Kazuma's. It would be an unacceptable risk to enter the city at this point, not until things had calmed down. The 2 beasts fought amongst the Fire Palace, crimson light ebbing and dimming as they collided with each other, sprang apart and collided with each other again. A part of the wall was destroyed, something hung in the air and streaks of fire shot up to meet it by the hundreds. At roughly the same time, great plumes of fire burst into existence, and then the 2 presences collided again. There was a flare of light, a sudden and terrible surge of pressure washed over them even at the distance they were, and then 2 beams of brilliant light shot up into the air. One slammed into the spire of the Fire Palace and it disappeared in an instant, shattered under the terrible force of the attack. The other struck the barrier and it too disappeared, cracked purple light falling down to the ground akin to broken glass. Spark Eye watched in silence. Something had happened, and one of the foul presences had considerably weakened the second one to have appeared. For a moment, it seemed as if Kazuma had had his victory, but then the first one abruptly disappeared and the city fell into silence. With the failure of the barrier, reinforcements were rapidly approaching, hundreds of shinobi from Konoha sprinting at the city at breakneck pace. Spark Eye had seen enough. The battle was lost. Konoha had been weakened, but they had ultimately prevailed. Team Spark did not have the military might to take the capital themselves, and their assets seemed to have either perished or were about to fall into the rapidly closing net of approaching Leaf Nin. Operation Spark was concluded. Contact. Spark Ivy's hands flashed in sudden alarm. Close range, 20 meters, 4 shinobi from the east. She paused. 7 shinobi from the east, 9 from the west. She paused again and quietly shook her head. We're surrounded. Spark Eye felt the barest flicker of frustration forming at the pit of his stomach. He stood up, casually brushing aside the emotion as he had been doing all of his life, and surveyed the area around them. However they had done it, a full platoon of shinobi surrounded them, not even trying to hide their presence now. They wore black robes and blank white-faced masks, and stood on the branches of the trees all around them, staring silently at them. They made no move to attack as Team Spark fell back in a close, defensive formation. The barrier around them, apparently useless, fell. From one of the branches came the first sound that the approaching enemies had made, and it was the sound of wood hitting wood. From the shadows came an old man leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His arm was bandaged and drawn tight to his chest, and he wore strips of cloth around his forehead and down on of his eyes. He stood on the branch, surveying them with one half-closed eye. So you're the ones who have been playing in my backyard, the old man said quietly. His mouth twitched. Of course you would come to observe the results of your efforts. Spark Eye did not move. Behind him, he could hear a faint buzz of insects moving in the darkness, and the shadows cast down by the bright moon were slowly extending their way. You should be proud, the old man continued. Your operations were masterfully done. He drew a sword from the top of his cane and pointed the gleaming blade at them. Then, his voice rose as he addressed his men. Take them alive, if possible. Spark Eye knew what must be done. He felt only the slightest pang of regret as he made a single hand seal in a single instant, just as the other operatives lunged at them. Shadows fell upon them, freezing them in position, and they were suddenly surrounded by a hazy sphere of insects. It was too late, however, and Spark Eye watched steadily as his unsuspecting teammates were consumed with blue flame. Spark 3 let out a startled shriek. She had not been expecting the suicide technique as fire exploded from every orifice, and she managed to raise a trembling hand. Spark V and her brushed fingertips, both forms alight, and then the rest of their bodies were consumed by the powerful flames. Even as he too burned live, Spark Eye held himself strong. He ignored the other shinobi around them, even as the first ineffective water techniques were produced, and instead he looked up at the sky. His mask fell from his face, revealing a scarred, hardened face, but the expression on it was almost wistful. Whatever Spark Eye was thinking at his final moments caused him to smile faintly. Then, he too disappeared underneath the raging blue flame and his entire world went white. 1 week after the Kanoshi rebellion, Uzumaki Naruto stood in the fire palace just before a grand set of doors. His armor, vest and mask were gone, and he wore a set of very formal robes. Red silk fell down to his ankles, bound with a bright yellow sash, and a cloak of sleek black adorned his back. On the cloak were a series of images that had been carefully stitched into brilliant fabric, of a terrible crimson figure and a small shinobi with blonde hair fighting. Naruto was currently wearing a set of clothes that was probably worth more than anything he had ever earned in his life. The Land of Wind silk was pleasant to wear, but he nonetheless felt extremely uncomfortable. It didn't help that the real fight against the false Jinchuriki had gone nothing like the fight that had been depicted on his cloak, and depicted of the large tapestry that the seamstresses and servants had been working on all week. Nonetheless, Naruto knew better than to say anything when presented with the clothes as a gift from the Fire Lord himself. The young, blonde Anbu stood there stonily. 2 of the surviving guardians, those that had returned with the Fire Lord's son, flanked him, either protecting him from others, or protecting the others from him. A gaggle of servants and attendants flocked around him, the drab brown robes rather plain when contrasted with his own clothes, and they fretted over him, tucking back his hair, smoothing out his robes and generally brushing against him. They were too close, and Naruto resisted his well-honed instincts, which were insisting that he should retreat and possibly bombard them all with a fire technique. It had been a week since the attempted coup d'état by Kazuma, and Naruto had unfortunately been out for most of its conclusion. The battle with the false Jinchuriki had been taxing, and he had only awakened 3 days later under the watchful eyes of Jiraiya and Tsunade. The latter had been there to tend to his medical needs, and the former had been there to inspect his seal. His transformation into what Jiraiya was calling a version 2 Jinchuriki form had been hushed up as much as possible, but nonetheless the third Hokage had been evidently concerned enough about the stability of the seal to call for Konoha's premier sealing expert. Jiraiya had examined it for about half an hour, poking at Naruto's exposed stomach and humming thoughtfully at times. Naruto had took it all stoically, but he had nonetheless felt relieved when Jiraiya had proclaimed that there was nothing to worry about, although the brief look on his face made Naruto think that the spiky white-haired man had wanted to add, yet, to the end of his sentence. With Kazuma dying rather unexpectedly, and his false Jinchuriki falling 5 or so minutes later, the rest of the rebellion had been rather lackluster. Konoha reinforcements had come quite from their positions quite quickly, and with the falling of the barrier, they had entered the city in force. Whatever puppetry or medical technique that had somehow allowed Kazuma to field an army of corpses had been no match for seasoned shinobi, and they had been promptly put down with ease. There seemed to have been a time limit against the technique, because as the sun rose the next day all of the corpses had promptly exploded into heaps of dirt, ash and crumbling paper. A few of the fake Jinchuriki had caused some problems. The insane, young, crimson-cloaked children that had been roaming the city had fought to the death. They had not communicated in any way, and attacked with the savagery of a wild animal. There had been some injuries, and even a couple of fatalities. A Chunin squad had blundered into a house with 2 of them, and by the time reinforcements had arrived to assist them, 15 men and women were dead. Nevertheless, they too had fallen in the end. The other Leaf Nin had picked up about them what Naruto had. For all their aggressiveness and power, the fake Jinchuriki were ultimately uncoordinated and easy to confuse and mislead. They had been put down within the first hour, and the tiny, broken bodies had been collected for analysis. Shinobi casualties had been low. Civilian casualties had been high. Many had been slain in their homes, torn apart by creatures and constructs far more powerful than they were. They had never had a chance, the false Jinchuriki were too mad to reason with, and the Walking Dead had shown no remorse as they had cut down all who stood within their path. The death toll was quite easily in the thousands. Of course, as the Fire Lord had said to his advisors, nobody important had died, so it really didn't matter. It didn't matter that the Fire Lord and the Hokage, the 2 people tasked with the protection of the citizens in the Land of Fire, had used them as bait. It didn't matter that the 2 of them had left them to die, a city full of men, women and children to distract and slow the enemy as they had advanced. Naruto had taken one look at the Fire Lord and his quirky smile and that stupid fan and had vowed never to underestimate the ruthlessness of the man. As eccentric as the man was, or at least appeared to be, there was a vicious streak within him, and although he was the newly favored shinobi of the Fire Court, Sarutobi had warned him time and time again that the whims of the nobility were fickle and never to be trusted. He had felt a surge of anger when he had heard the Fire Lord casually talking to his advisors by his bedside table, and he had clenched his fists underneath the blankets. Nothing had shown on his face as he shoveled the anger and disgust away, but he was briefly surprised when the sounds of chains did not disturb him as he did so. Whatever had happened that night, it had weakened or drained the pit. It wasn't necessarily a nice feeling, more of something empty and hollow inside of him. That void had been quickly filled with a vicious sense of satisfaction as Sarutobi had described the fate of the Black Ops team that had crossed him all those times. A special team of highly trained infiltrators who that was Sarutobi was quite vague on had set up observation posts all around the edge of the city, and they had located the enemy team observing the rebellion. When confronted and cornered, they had killed themselves with a powerful suicide technique, burned alive in a matter of seconds. The downside was that they perhaps would never know who had sent them. Perhaps examinations from Kazuma's body would bring something to light. It had been collected, as had 2 more bodies found on the outskirts of the city. Judging by their equipment and scrolls, they had been the ones responsible for the raising of the barrier techniques and the coordination of the Walking Dead. They had been killed with single, fatal blows, and all evidence and lack of apparent resistance indicated that the 2 shinobi had known their attacker. Naruto knew who had been responsible. Tobi, whoever he was, had ultimately been the one responsible for all of this. He didn't really understand why, but he had told Sarutobi everything the man in the orange mask had said. When it had come to Tobi's final message to the 3rd Hokage, Naruto had watched as the old man had visibly staggered back. The Hokage had looked stunned, even dazed, as he leaned on the table, his mouth parting in shock. His face had shown a myriad of emotions: despair, shock, anger, and a sudden clarity that had made the old man straighten up and press his lips thinly together, exhaling loudly. Regardless of whom Tobi was and however true his claim may or may not have been, he had just made an enemy out of the 3rd Hokage. Very few awarded that status tended to survive for very long. Naruto was interrupted by the sound of creaking doors. A boy, barely out of his teens dressed in fine white robes, poked his head out. "Please enter, Uzumaki-sama," he said nervously, and then disappeared before Naruto could respond. Naruto straightened as the attendants left him, bowing and murmuring. The two guardians swung open the doors, their faces blank and their crimson sashes gleaming under the light, and they stood to the side as Naruto walked through. He had entered a large room. A red carpet had been laid from the door to the front of the room. Large polished wood tables had been put to the side of the room, and a large crowd of men, women and children stood there. They wore the robes of the nobility, the men were rather portly, the women were thin and wore heavy makeup and the children were bright-eyed. They stared at him as he walked past, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silent room. At the front of the room was a set of steps. At the top of the steps was a large table, and standing in front of that table were some of the most important people in the Land of Fire. On the left stood the third Hokage, dressed in his ceremonial robes of red and white, and flanking him was Mitokado Homura and Utatane Koharu. On the right stood Akiko, surrounded by two of her ladies-in-waiting, and behind her stood half a dozen nobles. Naruto picked out Lord Shinji as one of them, the portly man nodding approvingly as Naruto approached them. The Fire Lord stood at the head of the group. His fan was up, half of his face hidden by his fan. His one visible eye watched Naruto carefully, something lurking within its depths, and his body language was unreadable. He wore giant red robes that flowed to the floor, tied with a huge yellow sash that draped down to his knees, and a tall, rectangular head with the symbol of fire adorned his head. Naruto approached the Fire Lord and bowed deeply. He remained crouched down as the Fire Lord took a step towards. Then, the leader of the Land of Fire spoke, his voice loud and audible to all those in the room. "Today we are here to celebrate the actions of a most wonderful shinobi," the Fire Lord began. He snapped his fan shut, the instrument disappearing in his sleeve, and he opened up his arms with a wide smile. "Oh yes, a most wonderful shinobi indeed. Uzumaki Naruto has served the Land of Fire well. He has fought against its enemies and protected its citizens, and oh my, what a wonderful job he has done indeed." With his head bowed, Naruto couldn't see anything apart from the Fire Lord's luxurious robe trims pulled against the feudal lord's feet. Nonetheless, he could hear the rustle of robes as the man shifted, and he could swear he could feel the eyes of the man staring down at him. "He has saved our nation against the perilous threat of Sky Country, single-handedly defeating the wicked leader of that villainous trash. He has saved this city from the treason of a man who should have been our protector." He stopped, and a hand came down to rest on his blonde locks. Naruto resisted the urge to shudder. "He has saved my daughter from the tyranny of a murderer," the Fire Lord continued quietly, and more somberly. "He has saved my life. He has saved all of your lives. He has fought against the darkness to keep us safe. He has battled a demon, and foiled a plot on my own life. Uzumaki Naruto is a true protector of the realm." There was a short silence. Then, somebody behind him started clapping. First one, and then two and then a dozen, and then hundreds of clapping men, women and children echoed out in the large room. For all the applause they gave, not a single one made any other noise apart from that. The pressure on his head was removed as the Fire Lord lifted up his hand. "Rise, Uzumaki Naruto," he ordered. Naruto straightened up and stood there, his eyes locked firmly a point of the wall behind the Fire Lord. The eyes of hundreds bore down on him and he did not like it. Nonetheless, it was his duty to withstand it, and so he did as he always did and obeyed. Naruto is a true shinobi. He is the epitome of the will of fire. He will protect the Land of Fire as long as he shall live. The Fire Lord cried out. A sly smile had crossed his face, and he looked distinctly pleased as the nobles clapped for Naruto again. Then, he raised his hands and the audience went quiet in an instant. "For his actions here, and his impeccable service record of the last 7 years, I am gifting Uzumaki Naruto with an adage," the Fire Lord continued. He swelled up, patting Naruto on the head almost as if the blonde shinobi was a dog. "His friends call him the right hand of God. His enemies call him nothing, for they are all dead. Oh ho ho ho." He laughed, and many of the other nobles chuckled politely. "However, for those foolish enough to challenge the Land of Fire again, they will first have to come through our protectors." The Fire Lord boomed out. He flung an arm out, gesturing towards Naruto and almost hitting the shinobi in the face. Standing at the front of our protectors will be this shinobi, Uzumaki Naruto, the right hand of God and the demon's bane. The nobles burst out into applause as the Fire Lord plashed a sash around his chest. It was much like the sash of the 12 guardians, however it was gold and a terrible demon had been stitched upon it with crimson silk. A shinobi stood above it, a hand frozen in a seal, a permanent battle between man and demon depicted on the award. Through all of this, Naruto was smiling, not because of the award but because the irony was really not lost on him at all. There was a feast. The tables were brought to the center of the room and servants and attendants streamed out of the kitchens with platters and plates laden with rich foods, exotic spices and goblets and pitchers of the finest wines. Naruto sat on the right of the Fire Lord, while the third Hokage sat on the left, and the two powerful men chatted to each other over the glasses of wine. The Fire Lord's face was red as he finished his third cup, saying something to Sarutobi, who merely responded quietly and smiled faintly as the Fire Lord erupted into a fit of laughter, clapping the most powerful shinobi in the land of fire on the back. On Naruto's right sat Akiko, the Fire Lord's daughter. She was dressed in her finest clothes, silks and cloth draped in such a way that revealed tantalizing flashes of thigh and shoulder as she moved. It shimmered around her, sparkling underneath the light as if it was made from blue diamonds, and her hair flowed down her back, twisted in an elaborate braid. She looked absolutely beautiful and Naruto would have loved to have talked to her, but Lord Shinji sat on her other side and was engaging her rather enthusiastically. The Fire Princess responded politely, laughing demurely and blushing at the most appropriate times as a man 3 times her age and 6 times her weight drank from his goblet. The more wine he consumed, the more he seemed to leer at her. From what Naruto understood, an important justice in the Fire Court had been found dead in the ruins of the city. Lord Kinjo had been struck down by his enemies after refusing Konoha's protection, tortured and beaten, but he had remained a patriot to the very end, or so the official story went. Lord Shinji was a popular option to replace the man, and Naruto could only feel a flash of indignation at the thought of what incentives the Fire Lord would offer. Perhaps even the hand of his daughter. There were plenty of other girls who would be eager to take her place, Naruto noted dryly. He wasn't an expert on social relationships and girls and all that stuff, but even he, oblivious as he may be, could tell that he was receiving quite a lot of attention. Several of the ladies of the Fire Court, some his age, many a great deal older, threw him looks. Many of those looks were coy, suggestive smiles, twirling skirts and swaying hair. Others were more speculative, as if the matriarchs of the great noble families were looking at him wondering just which daughter they would throw at him. Now that he was the Fire Lord's favorite, he was very popular. Naruto could only smile thinly and look away. This fake level of adoration, the false smiles and the blatant praise and hero worship, it was sickening in a way. Some part of him definitely liked it, but another part, the shinobi part, could only see all of it as a threat. That was probably the smart part, Naruto decided. Somebody touched his hand. Naruto jerked and looked up. The dark eyes of Akiko met his and she smiled. As a troupe of entertainers entered the room and began playing music, and nobles began to rise and pair off, the two of them rose. Naruto took the Fire Princess's hand and they entered the crowd. Then, Naruto used a near-perfect body flicker to take both him and Akiko out of the room. The last thing he saw was the blatant disapproval of the 12 guardians and the third Hokage, both watching him. Sometime later, Naruto and Akiko broke apart from their latest kiss. The branches, twigs and leaves of plants around them dug into his back, but the blonde boy found that he really didn't care. His heart was pounding, something heavy pushed against the pit of his stomach and his senses were heightened. Akiko's presence filled him, her smell, her taste, the sound of her voice, and the feel of her hair. Naruto licked his lips, feeling a surge of affection for the girl as she smiled at him, tenderly brushing his hair out of his eyes. There was a member of the 12 guardians nearby, but Naruto honestly didn't care. Akiko's warm body was pressed against him, his fumbling hands roamed her back and she shuddered, mewling into his ear, her soft hair tickling his face. He kissed her again and when they broke apart, Akiko giggled and laid her head down on his shoulder. The ground around the palace gardens was still cratered. Big chunks of the wall still littered the grounds and the wall itself had been shored up temporarily. Large swathes of grass and plants had been burned in the blaze, and some of the blackened husks remained. Other sections of the garden were just in tatters, resembling the rocky fields of the land of earth rather than the fertile plains of the land of fire. The Fire Princess was looking up, staring at the scaffolding that covered the top of the Fire Palace. The eternal flame burned once more, this time through the use of natural gas rather than an elaborate seal matrix, and repairs had already begun on the spire. It must have been so terrifying, she murmured into his shoulder. She stroked his hair, nestling deeper into him, and turned her head to stare up at him with her lovely eyes. What a terrible battle it must have been. You were so brave. Naruto didn't really know what to say to that. He settled with a small shrug, and Akiko giggled. You're so tough, she cooed, flicking him on the nose. Naruto flinched and she outright laughed. Then, seeing his wounded expression, she leaned up for another kiss. Don't worry. I like that about you. Naruto couldn't help the smile that crossed his face, and he stroked her hair. Akiko was quiet for a little while longer, content to just lay there as Naruto played with her hair. That woman, she trailed off, sounding a touch nervous. The one that pretended to be Shizu, what happened to her? Naruto paused in his ministrations. I fought her, he answered quietly. Did you kill her? Akiko asked. She gazed up at him, and there was nothing but sincerity on her face. At Naruto's blank expression, she let out a shuddering breath. Oh, she trailed off. She lowered her hands to her lap and wriggled out of Naruto's grip. With her head bowed, Naruto was suddenly fearful that he had offended her. Then, her hands clenched, bunching up the material on her thighs, and she looked back up at him. There was a fleeting look on her face, something vicious and dangerous, and Naruto was abruptly reminded who her father was. Good, she whispered darkly. I hope she suffered, the bitch. Then her look faded into sorrow. I like Shizu, she trailed off in a quitter, sadder voice. Naruto embraced her and they kissed again. Did you really fight a demon? Akiko asked between kisses. A real demon. Naruto nodded and pointed to the spire. It did that, he murmured huskily. Or did he do that? His hormone-fogged mind couldn't remember at the moment. If a genin decided to assassinate him at the moment, he probably would have been an easy target, yet Akiko's lips came crashing down on his even hungrier than before and he really didn't care. You're so strong, Naruto, Akiko gasped as she came up for a breath. Her hand was tangled in his hair, tugging almost painfully at it, and she had placed his hand on her lower back. You're so strong. Naruto thought about the chains and the darkness and the eyes of the nine-tailed demon fox. Not really, he murmured. He drew back and flopped onto his back. Akiko joined him, and they stared up at the stars. When do you leave? Akiko asked softly as she curled up around him. It must have been a ridiculous sight, a teenage girl nearly out of her teens wrapping her body around a boy just entering his. Tomorrow, Naruto responded lazily. He took a deep breath, so very tempted just to lie there and sleep with this warm girl beside him. Before the sun comes up. Will I see you again? Akiko asked, sounding even softer than before. Her voice wavered a bit and Naruto turned his head to gaze at her. Of course, Naruto assured her quickly. You can't get rid of me that easily. Akiko looked happy. Maybe I'll request you for a mission, she teased with a giggle. You can help me shop and entertain me and my friends. I'm sure you know lots of tricks. Naruto smiled faintly. My team only does special kinds of missions, he responded. Like what? Dangerous stuff, Naruto answered. Secret stuff I can't tell you about. Naruto felt rather proud of saying that, and he appreciated the look of amazement and awe he received from Akiko. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated, and she breathed in, her chest heaving dangerously close. Naruto smiled, and she smiled back rather wickedly, pulling him down and drowning him in another kiss. Naruto and Sarutobi departed from the capital city early in the morning, before the sun had even risen. They were accompanied by a squad of Jonin guard, more of a formality than anything else given the large numbers of shinobi present in the region. They returned to Konoha in good time, and entered the village gates as the sun was beginning to rise. Normally, only the early rises would be up by now, tending to the bakeries and milk deliveries, but as the group of shinobi entered the village, they were greeted with a large crowd. Men and women, shinobi and civilian, lined the streets as the group walked past on foot. The third Hokage had his hat on, his eyes almost disappearing underneath the hem of it, and Naruto walked on his right. As they walked past, the crowds cheered and clapped, hollering and yelling praise and acclaim. Many of the shinobi bowed their heads respectfully, and Naruto was surprised to see that it was at him. Then, the third Hokage abruptly pulled ahead, leaving Naruto behind, and the crowds continued to clap and cheer. His eyes were wide and his heart was racing, an unbidden smile crossing his face when he realized that they were all here to see him. Not the Hokage him. He stood straighter, pleased at their acknowledgement, proud to be recognized by his village. When compared to the nobles of the Fire Court, this was much more honest and sincere, and Naruto felt like he was 6 again as he beamed in happiness. His good mood didn't end there as he arrived at the Hokage's office. The third Hokage sat behind his desk, while the rest of Team Sigma stood around it. As he entered, they all came to attention and bowed their heads. Naruto stopped, staring as they raised up. Yuka waved at him, grinning brightly, and Daichi smiled. Kage gave a slight, but meaningful, nod, and Komaki bowed her head respectfully, and Toa gave him a thumbs up. Sasuke stood there and rolled his eyes, huffing and looking away, but there was a slight smile on his face. The third Hokage cleared his throat. We have no time for any more slacking off, Naruto, he reprimanded rather lightly. You have been officially reinstated as Team Sigma's captain. The Land of Fire is in a mess right now, and we need every shinobi on the roster. He paused, and then the ends of his lips rose. Approval. Praise. Acknowledgement. Get to work, Naruto, Sarutobi snapped a second later, the moment gone but not forgotten. Naruto saluted, placing the mask on his face. He had the respect of the village. He had the acknowledgement of the feudal court. He had his team back. Things were looking good. The brief yet memorable civil war of the Land of Fire had some serious local and international repercussions. Although political struggles, and even outright violence, weren't unknown, it had been a long time since the very heart of the Land of Fire had been struck. Not since the First Great War had Kanoshi, the capital, had been witness to shinobi-based combat, and never had the palace been directly attacked. To many in the international community, it signified weakness. The tense relationship between the Fire Court, the populace and the village hidden in leaves had not gone unnoticed, and the eyes of the world had been watching and judging. Yet, although Kanoshi had been attacked for the first time in decades, and the relationship between the Fire Court and its hidden village had deteriorated to its lowest point since Konoha's inception, the outcome of the attempted coup was a contradiction. To the world, Konoha and the Land of Fire must be weak for such an event to happen. Yet, Konoha and the Land of Fire must also be strong for such a victory to happen. Much of what had happened was unknown, but it was generally agreed that the perpetrators of the civil war had attacked the capital city with an army, and spearheading that army was a Jinchuriki. Konoha's Jinchuriki had been deployed to counter the enemy, and had proven to be the stronger. The third Hokage had saved the Fire Lord's life from an assassination attempt, and an entire division of Leaf Nin had arrived just in time to mop things up. Not much more was known other than that. The only other really conclusive piece of information was that Konoha's Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto, was rapidly growing into his power. From his first emergence as one of Konoha's significant powers during the Sky Country Blitz more than 8 months ago, Uzumaki Naruto had been at the forefront of every significant mission, and his presence had more often than not led to victory. In less than a year, a seemingly mediocre B-rank shinobi had risen up in the ranks, fighting and surviving confrontations against S-ranked opponents, destroying fortresses and invading armies, and defeating Jinchuriki in single-handed combat. Uzumaki Naruto had risen to an A-rank status, his deeds and reputation were beginning to grow, and his rise to fame was absolutely stunning. How long would it take such a shinobi to reach the coveted position of S-rank? Naruto was not only being recognized by foreign powers. Inside Konoha, most shinobi knew of him and his deeds. For the younger of them, Naruto was somewhat of an inspiration. He was close to their age, yet the distance between them was near insurmountable. He was somebody to look up to and idolize. For the older generation, Naruto was one to look at with nostalgia and anticipation. Here was another shinobi destined for legendary status, one like the revered few before him who would rise up and, one day, lead him to victory like those before him and, in time, make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the village. Senju Tobiramu. Tsukumo Hatake. Namikaze Minato. One day, many said, Uzumaki Naruto's name would be on that list. His name was now well known throughout the Land of Fire. All of the Fire Court knew of his new position as the Fire Lord's favorite, and his newly gained moniker, Demonsbane, had spread. For Konoha, it was a blessing, for the minor nobility swarmed to the village vying for the attention of the Fire Lord's new favorite, all in the slightest chance that they could use and exploit this new relationship. For Naruto, it was an annoyance. In the last 2 months, he and his team had been on 23 missions. Each involved a trivial task unsuited for a Jonin. Most could have been easily classed as a D-rank mission, suitable for a Genin squad, not a battle-ready Anbu squad. Sure, Team Sigma was able to complete the missions 10 times faster and more efficiently than a Genin team, but it was honestly beneath them. They were Team Sigma, the Hokage's personal squad. They were supposed to go on missions vital to the village security, not babysit the 7-year-old of a noble or deliver a parcel to a minor noble's estate. Nonetheless, the Hokage was more than happy to exploit Naruto's new status for his own ends. The young Anbu captain was certain that it was just another way to torment him, although the revenue coming in from the excessive fees the village was charging for the Jinchuriki's services was probably a factor as well. Either way, Team Sigma was delegated to the most menial of tasks. Between the tedious missions, they trained. Naruto ducked and pivoted on his feet, parrying away several shuriken with his kunai while simultaneously avoiding the swipe of the glowing crimson blade. The soil beneath his feet was damp with the recent rains and his feet sagged slightly as he backpedaled, on the defensive. In front of him, Toa, wielding a glowing crimson short sword that had formed in his hands, continued on with his relentless attack. The older Anbu agent was a blur, the blade striking for Naruto again and again and again in an attempt to stop the blonde from utilizing any hand seals. Above them both, Yuka flitted between the trees, providing long-range support by peppering kunai and shuriken at him. There was a flicker of movement from one tree to the next, and Naruto tracked it even as he dodged, ducked and weaved around all of Toa's strikes. Yuka reappeared, her long blonde hair fluttering in the breeze as she held her hand in a single hand seal. Even as Naruto jumped back from Toa, the genjutsu she had prepared ensnared him and his vision grew blurry. Bright flashes of light and hazy swirls appeared in his vision. At the same time, a cacophony of blaring shrieks and hair-splitting screeches struck his ears, and although they were merely a chakra-transmitted neural impulse, it was enough to make him stagger. That was what the third of the attackers had been waiting for, and Uchiha Sasuke, his crimson eyes swirling, lunged forward from his ambush position. He clutched a spool of wire in one hand and a kunai in the other, a tag fluttering off at the end. Toa leapt forward at the same time, the crimson sword bursting into a shower of sparks. Dark, inky seals grew on his arm as he formed another of the infinite weapons he could create, and a crimson, stubby baton appeared in his hand. He disappeared in a flicker of movement, then reappeared on Naruto's right, his baton blurring towards his head. Sasuke attacked from the left, the wire in his hand coiled and ready to spring around him. Yuka stayed in the trees, focusing her genjutsu on him with a frightening intensity. It was a well-coordinated and effective strategy meant to disable and capture an uncooperative target. In this case, however, the target refused to go along with it. With a single flare of his chakra, Naruto broke the genjutsu and felt a mild sense of relief as disorientating stimuli was removed from his senses. He sidestepped, parrying away the baton with his kunai. The metal scraped against the crimson power and sparks flew through the air. Naruto channeled a quick burst of chakra into his other hand and swiped at the sparks, and a gust of wind shot them at Sasuke, who instinctively covered up his eyes. In the split second that it had taken the Uchiha to do that, Naruto weaved past another one of Toa's swipes and delivered a snap kick to Sasuke's jaw. The other boy reeled backwards with a pained grunt, even as Naruto blocked a blow from Toa on one of his forearm guards. The searing crimson light scraped against the metal of his arm guard, creating a shower of sparks, but it held up against the attack, leaving Naruto to lean forward with the kunai in his hand. He stabbed at Toa, and the other man hastily backed away from the quick, sudden movement, and then disappeared in a flicker of movement as Naruto's cheeks bulged. A huge, fiery ball of yellow flame spewed forward, enveloping the other half of the clearing with chakra-induced flame. The fires wouldn't last long. Naruto hadn't pumped in a lot of chakra to the technique, but the smokescreen it created would shield him from Yuka's current attacks, forcing her to switch positions if she wanted to be effective. True enough, as Sasuke and Toa righted themselves, there was another flicker of movement amongst the trees. Yuka had shifted from one side of the clearing to the other, perched on one of the lower tree branches with her hands twisted into a seal. Before she could produce a technique, however, Naruto made a seal of his own. Detonate. The teenage girl let out a startled and ungainly squawk as the tree she was standing on rocked and swayed. Explosive tags hidden over the tree, held there by wire and kunai, detonated. They were small, producing mostly sound and smoke, but it staggered Yuka's guard, giving Naruto an opportunity to act. He raced for the tree, throwing a series of smoke bombs down on the ground as he did so. Huge, white plumes of smoke arose all around him, and the tree in front of him disappeared underneath the haze, but Naruto knew where he was going. Sasuke and Toa, lost within the smoke, would reflexively hesitate, giving Naruto the time he needed. He sprinted through the fog and darted up the tree in an instant, reaching Yuka just as she had righted herself. She lashed out at him with a kick, but he parried it away with his arm guard and moved in close. She backpedaled, her eyes wide, and managed to dodge the first and second blow, but the third knocked her off of the branch. She fell with a grunt, but twisted herself in the air, grabbed a branch, and used her momentum to swing away. Naruto was right behind her, avoiding her hasty shuriken throws. He reached into one of his pouches as he ran and hurled a series of kunai at her. The weapons missed, striking the trees around them with a dull thump. Yuka landed on a branch and twisted on her feet to face him. Jumping backwards, she made 3 hand seals and thrust her hands at him. Naruto broke through the genjutsu in an instant, but the second one made him stumble for a split second as his world went fuzzy and full of static. An instant later, he had recovered, but Yuka had escaped him. Naruto drew his head back, made a hand seal, and spat out a huge globe of flames. They roared towards her, enveloping the tree branches around her, leaving the Yamanaka very little room to escape, but then 3 kunai went whizzing past her. 2 thudded in the ground in front of her, and 1 embedded itself in the branch above her. Seal tags fluttered at either end, and from the rapidly clearing smoke beneath them Sasuke shouted something. A thin, flimsy-looking azure barrier sprung into existence between each tag, creating a triangular shield that shielded Yuka completely. The huge ball of flame struck the barrier and it flared with a bright blue light, holding of the flames even as the trees on the branches around them caught alight. Naruto twitched in annoyance as the barrier technique successfully defended the Yamanaka, but seized the opportunity to act. He disappeared in a body flicker and reappeared in the clearing. Water technique. Rising water wave. Water elemental chakra burst from the tenketsu in his throat, reacting with his internal bodily fluids, and his chest bulged with a sudden expansion of liquid. Naruto reared back and spat out a seemingly never-ending river of murky water. The raging river of water washed over the clearing, and the fires hissed and spat as they were extinguished in an instant. Toa, the main target of the technique, slammed his hands together and placed them on the ground. A moderately large wall of stone rose before him, and the water struck it and was deflected, directed to either sides of it. Nonetheless, it had kept the man busy for a few moments, and Naruto charged at the suddenly undefended Sasuke. Sasuke, his Sharingan whirling, moved to engage him. He settled in a defensive stance, watching Naruto intently as the blonde boy approached. Something flickered in the air and Naruto twisted awkwardly, avoiding a set of wire that would have tangled him up, but then a second set came from left, and he stumbled as his arms were tangled together. Sasuke, the glint of victory in his eyes, charged and kicked him, delivering a powerful blow to his chest. Naruto doubled over, gasping, and then exploded in a puff of smoke. The wires fell, loosened slack and then snapped right back up, pulling back towards Sasuke by a third wire coming from behind the Uchiha. Sasuke looked stunned even as he tried to escape, but they wrapped around him and pinned him tight to the ground, restraining his arms and his legs. A second later, Naruto appeared over him and slammed his elbow in his stomach. Sasuke grunted, his eyes bulging, and a second later, he rolled over and emptied his stomach. The rest of the fight didn't take long. Less than a minute later, Yuka was down, and a minute and a half later, Toa too shared the fate of his teammates, unable to keep up with Naruto's superior reflexes, speed and skill. Naruto trussed up the older, groaning man, panting with mild exertion. Sweat beaded down on his brow and the sun beamed down on him as the clearing went eerily quiet. Time. Daichi called out. The Hyuga stood at the top of the tree in the clearing, holding a watch and wearing a smile. 2 minutes, 17 seconds. New record, boss. Ha. Komaki crowed from next to him. She jumped down, landing effortlessly on the clearing, and sauntered up to the trussed up and tied down Toa. She gave him a none too gentle kick, to which he swore futilely at her. You lose. Last 3 minutes my ass. More like 3 seconds. Bite me, Toa groaned. I think Naruto broke one of my ribs. Fuck that, Sasuke uncharacteristically swore in a weak voice. His face was pale, flecks of vomit stick clinging to his lips and chin. I think Naruto just broke my spleen. Could somebody untie me? Yuka's voice was muffled, her face planted right in the muddy ground. This is really disgusting. Naruto let out a deep breath, stretching his arms. He was all warmed up now. He smiled as his team bickered around him, the others being helped up. Most of the team had come to join him in the clearing, but Kage remained in the trees. He stared down at his captain expressionlessly, but there was an almost anticipatory air around him. Naruto's smile widened, his canines exposed, and Kage's fingers twitched towards the dull black machete strapped to his back. The older Jonin was really the only one on his team that could provide a challenge in close-range combat. None of the others could match Naruto's speed. He was actually faster than Kage as well. The other operative, however, could match Naruto and stop the Jinchuriki from utilizing a lot of his techniques. Kage's style and form was simple, brutal and effective, short, sharp movements that emphasized stabs focused on the 8 vital areas. This was backed up with good reflexes, decent speed, and over 15 years of experience. Naruto got the impression that the 20-something-year-old man quite enjoyed their spars. He was all ready to begin another round of training when the screech of the bird cut through his thoughts. Frowning, he turned his head and watched as a proud hawk with beautiful plumage soared through the sky. Mentally checking the roster, Naruto shook his head, suddenly feeling weary. We have another mission, he muttered sourly. The mood of the team abruptly changed. Yuka groaned, Daichi shook his head, and Sasuke closed his eyes. Even Kage looked distinctly annoyed. His eyebrow had raised 1/4 inch. I know, Naruto sighed, holding up his hands in an effort to placate them. Just think of the money, guys. Money which we don't get, Toa muttered sourly. It's for the good of the village, Komaki recited dully. Couldn't we, go on a suicide mission or something? Yuka moaned. She ran a hand through her blonde hair. We'd be serving the village, and it would be more interesting than this. Who knows? Maybe the old man might have something interesting for us this time. Naruto mused. I have something interesting for you this time, the third Hokage remarked cheerfully. Team Sigma stood before the Hokage's desk, decked in the robes and masks of their profession. At the head of the small group, Naruto resisted the urge to shout, bullshit, even as his eye twitched behind his mask. The old man's genial smile was too happy, and the overexcited man practically bouncing next to him, seemed to contradict that statement. This is Eiji Suzumaki, Sarutobi introduced politely. He lifted a hand and gestured to Team Sigma. Eiji, my friend, these are my personal shinobi. I trust that you have heard of my personal aide, Uzumaki Naruto. Of course, Hiruzen, of course. The man responded excitedly. He was a young man, wearing the robes of the fire court and sporting a head spiky brown hair. He looked upon the Anbu squad eagerly, his eyes particularly drawn to Naruto. The young blonde Anbu rolled his eyes behind his mask even as he nodded respectfully. What are your orders, Hokage-sama? He asked quietly. Sarutobi gave a faint smile. Team Sigma, you are tasked with the protection of Lord Eiji back to his residence. He shifted some papers on his desk. This is an A-rank mission. Lord Eiji is a great friend of Konoha's, and must be protected, he continued. At his side, Lord Eiji straightened, looking chuffed at the Hokage's words. Naruto took in the words, bowing his head. He resisted the urge to sigh. Yet another mission to make a political statement. How fun. The small group departed from Konoha for their 5-day mission soon after. They traveled southeast, taking the main road through Otofukugai and continuing south from there, moving past the Land of Waves and heading towards the Land of Tea border. However, instead of heading west towards the border, they would instead go east towards the wall, the border between the Land of Fire and the Land of Water's only outpost on the main continent of the elemental countries. Won from the Land of Fire in the First Great Shinobi War and stubbornly held ever since, more battles had been fought between Konoha and Kirigakure in that narrow strip of land than anywhere else in the world. The constant battles between the two great villages had turned fertile plains and rolling hills of green into a muddy wasteland littered with craters and shrouded in fog. In every great war, Konoha had tried and failed to retake the land, more out of principle than for any strategic reason. In the Second War, an entire division of Leaf-Nin led by Naruto forced their way through Kirigakure's lines in an attempt to reconquer the land. The enemy lines had crumbled too easily, and the Leaf-Nin had advanced right up to the coast. By the time Ritsu had determined that it was a trap, it was too late. An S-rank shinobi, the leader of the 7 swordsmen of the mist, and his 6 subordinates counterattacked. In 3 hours, the bay was drenched with the blood and bodies of the 3/4 of a division, and not a single swordsman had fallen. The bay would always be referred to as the Bloody Cove. The incident was referred to as Ritsu's Folly, and it became a staple case study for any enterprising commander on exactly what not to do when encroaching on enemy territory. Ritsu had overextended, deployed her forces with limited intelligence on enemy forces and composition, and failed to protect her supply lines. In many ways, it was fortunate that she died during the ambush. 3rd Hokage's retaliation 2 days later, backed by the White Fang and some of his most trusted jonin, showed Kirigaku just how much Sarutobi appreciated the ambush. The enemy encampment was leveled, and several bays and inlets were formed as a result of the battle that took place. The second Leaf Nin invasion was much more thorough and destructive than the first, and 12 hours later, Konoha had retaken the cape and Sarutobi had claimed his 5th S-class kill, with only 2 survivors fleeing back to the land of water with the blades of the fallen. Unfortunately, the 3rd Hokage was forced to retreat by Kirigaku's counter-offensive, where the 2nd Mizukage deployed his Jinchuriki and drove away the encroaching Leaf Nin. With devastating losses taking place in the Land of Rain, and a renewed offensive from Kumo driving into the Land of Fire, Sarutobi was never able to retake the land. These days, the Bloody Cove was recognized as Land of Water territory. Konoha had initially built a small encampment during the last days of the Second War, circling much of the inlet in an attempt to contain and repel any further attack. It had been built up steadily over the years, and now a wall as large as Konoha's stretched down 60 kilometers, manned by an entire division of shinobi. Over 1,000 Leaf Nin rotated through the wall at any one time, protecting the only border of the great villages that lacked a buffer state. It had once been a center of trade between the Land of Fire and the Land of Water, delivering carts and shiploads of goods, from shoals of brightly colored fish meat, barrels of whale blubber, luminous pearls, gleaming silver coral, to trinkets and goods acquired from the far side of the planet, where only the Land of Water had ever trod. These days, since the inception of the Civil War, only a few merchants trickled in over the months, each under heavy guard by the Mizukage's personal elite. Business was conducted in near silence, Mizukage's guards there more to keep their charges from talking rather than to protect them. The hub, the largest city built by the wall, had fallen into recession since the Civil War. The reduced trade had severely reduced the flow of money coming in and out of the city. Nonetheless, when Naruto, the rest of Team Sigma and Lord Eiji had arrived at the city 5 days later, it was still bustling with people coming and going about their business. With 1,000 shinobi dedicated to protecting the region for over 40 years, a vibrant economy had sprung up around them. Bars, restaurants, casinos, theaters, brothels and other entertainment industries continued to do well as Leaf Nin rotated in and out of the city. An off-duty shinobi had needs, and the hub was more than willing to meet them. Lord Eiji strolled into his city, 24 servants and baggage holders following. Team Sigma had taken point around the small convoy, their black cloaks flapping in the cool wind. The sounds of the city washed over them as they made their way through the largest road of the city. Crowds of off-duty shinobi parted before them, many of them staggering and laughing with their friends as they moved from one establishment to the other. Many of them cast curious eyes over the group, but although they eyed the Anbu speculatively, ultimately it wasn't that unusual of an occurrence, and they passed through with little effort. Lord Eiji turned to Naruto, an eager look on his face. The blonde Anbu captain had been avoiding the noble for most of the journey, volunteering to take point and lead the sentry patrols around the convoy. "Many thanks for your company, Naruto," he said cheerfully. He gestured at the manor behind him, a wide smile on his face. "Please, it would be my honor if you were to dine with me tonight. I have the finest chefs in the region. I'm sure we can find something to suit your tastes." "That's very kind," Naruto said dryly, although Eiji didn't seem to pick up on it. "Unfortunately, I have a secondary mission to run for the Hokage." He held out his hand, wincing behind his mask as Lord Eiji shook it excitedly. "You were an excellent client, Lord Eiji, and Konoha's mission department will receive a great review from our squad." "Ah, excellent, excellent," Lord Eiji exclaimed, beaming. He rubbed his hands together. "Perhaps we'll work together in the future, yes." "Perhaps," Naruto said politely. He bowed his head. "Excuse us, Lord Eiji. Enjoy your dinner." Ah, yes. Thank you. Lord Eiji couldn't hide his disappointment as Naruto turned, motioning for his squad to follow him. They left the Lord in front of his residence, their mission complete. As soon as they were out of range, Yuka burst out laughing. She bent over, clutching her knees and extracting some startled glances from nearby residents. He had such a man crush on you. She squealed. So funny. Toa snorted, and then grunted as Komaki elbowed him in the stomach. Daichi was chuckling, and even Sasuke snorted in amusement. It's his pretty blonde hair, the Uchiha deadpanned. It drives the men wild. Ha! Naruto exclaimed sarcastically. Ha, 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 ha. Very funny. He took off his mask, making a face at them. Just for that, Sasuke, you're with me. The rest of you can shut your mouths and piss off. You've got the night off. Be back at the gates by sunrise. Dimmest. Kage and Komaki expertly saluted, while Daichi and Toa exchanged a high five. There were a series of puffs of smoke as the Anbu operatives placed a finger on their tattoos, storing away the uniform and exchanging it for a standard flak vest. Yuka was still giggling, and Naruto clenched his fists in annoyance. Luckily, Teen was cut off by Kage, who grabbed her by the back of the cloak and started dragging her away. What? No, hang on, you jerk, ow. Yuka's voice faded off into the distance. As for you, you little smartass, follow me, Naruto grumbled. Sasuke fell in line. Where are we going? He asked quietly. Naruto smiled thinly. We're going past the wall. Although the wall guarded the region from the Land of Water, it wasn't completely accurate to say that the wall represented the actual border. The border, having been agreed on at the end of the Third War after Konoha had once again failed to take the Bloody Cove, lay 20 kilometers past it. As such, Konoha had a series of observation posts scattered throughout the war-torn region, and Naruto had a message for one of those posts from the Hokage. Before they could leave, however, Naruto and Sasuke had to sign out. They approached the shinobi headquarters and filled in the required paperwork. As they were given the exit permits and map of this week's defenses, Naruto spotted the commander of the watch looking at him from his office. Naruto, the grandson of Naruto, had risen through the ranks, determined to take responsibility for his grandmother's folly. It was cold and damp outside the walls. Naruto and Sasuke moved away from the only road leading towards the Bloody Cove and into the mist surrounding it. Markers had been placed on the ground, each displaying a symbol and a color. Without the map that Naruto and Sasuke had memorized, it would have been easy to stray from the path and run into the nests of traps and primed explosive tags that had been buried all around them. It was a short journey, taken longer by the care that they needed to move through the traps, but eventually they moved through the small valley and out of the mist. The sky was darkening, the sun disappearing behind the horizon, but there was still enough light to see their surroundings. They were at the bottom of what once had been a large hill. It was full of craters, cracks and crevices, and one side of the hill was simply missing. The ground around them was muddied and dead, the aftermath of the battle between Sarutobi Hiruzen and the three-tailed Jinchuriki. Outpost Sierra had been built on the cratered remains of that hill. It was a small base, made up of rows of tents and small watchtowers. Naruto and Sasuke slowed as they approached the outpost, showing their hands as they were confronted by two Jonin. Given the lack of surprise on their faces, Naruto assumed that they had been spotted long before they had come close to the outpost. Identify, the lead Jonin demanded sternly. He was a tall, large man with thick arms and a bald head. He narrowed his eyes at the two of them. Naruto handed over the exit permit to the other Jonin, who took it and inspected it carefully. She nodded, and the lead Jonin surveyed them carefully. Dog, blue, 6, bird, town, the Jonin recited. 3, Naruto replied instantly. He took a breath. Desk, lamp, 5 and 9. The guards relaxed and the big, burly Jonin gave them a gruff nod. We have a message for the base commander, Naruto told them. He reached into his robes and pulled out a scroll, the Hokage's seal clearly displayed. Where might we find him? The lead Jonin jerked his head back towards the largest tent. He's in there, he said gruffly. Be quick. A Kiri cargo ship pulled into port earlier today. Runners might be coming. Rookies like you don't want to see that. Naruto exchanged a glance with Sasuke. The Uchiha gave a slight shrug. Together, they walked into the camp and approached the large tent. At least a platoon of shinobi was stationed at the camp, many sitting around small camp fires. There was soft chatter and mutterings between them, but they were generally a stoic and cheerless bunch. Many of them eyed Naruto and Sasuke stonily, although a few looked vaguely sympathetic. The only other thing of note was a large chain-linked fence on the other side of the camp. Beyond it was a dried lake bed, filled with crumbling stones and scattered with white dust. Past the plain were larger hills and the small twisted, gnarled trees, the first sign of nature that Naruto had seen here. The curious thing, though, was the thick yellow line that had been painted on the ground just beyond the fence, stretching all the way across the mouth of the dried lake bed. Then they were in the tent. Lanterns had been hung up from the rails, casting a yellow glow around the space, and a collapsible office desk had been set up in the corner. Behind it sat a gray-haired man. He eyed them stonily as they entered, his fingers tapping on the handle of a cane that lay across his desk. "I have a missive from the Hokage," Naruto said quietly. The commander nodded and Naruto passed him the message. The older man bit on his finger, producing a drop of blood, and smeared it on the seal. It glowed for a second and safety dispelled at the resonance of the commander's chakra, and grizzled man opened it up to read. It only took a few moments, and his eyes narrowed up at Naruto and Sasuke once he was done. "Thank you, Shinobi," he said in a raspy, guttural voice. He stood up, slightly wincing as went for the cane, and as he moved into better light Naruto could see the thick scar tissue that covered his left cheek and his lower jaw. There was a rough, jagged and angry-looking scar around his throat, and Naruto abruptly realized that somebody, somewhere, had tried to slit this man's throat. "I've been ordered to." The commander was cut off from the sudden commotion from outside. People were moving quickly, and a bell started to ring. Somebody rushed into the tent, pulling past the flap and barging in. "Sir," the panting Chunin gasped. "We have runners." The commander grimaced and jerked his head, indicating to Naruto and Sasuke to follow him. They left the tent and out into the darkened night. 24 shinobi had moved into positions around the fence, and as they passed one of the tents, Naruto saw a medical team prepping for action. The commander strode forward quickly, despite his limp, and moved to the fence. The large, bald Jonin moved to stand next him, arms folded. "Flares and lights," the commander muttered. "Flares and lights." The bald Jonin shouted, his voice booming out across the camp. "Light it up. Full coverage." Several shinobi made hand seals, and they shot glowing balls of light up into the air, which exploded and sent glittering shards of light falling to the ground, illuminating the area. At the same time, powerful floodlights on top of the sentry tower switched on with a loud click, lighting up the dried lake bed. Naruto could feel the heat from where he was standing, and his heart began racing faster. He signaled Sasuke to prepare for battle, and the Uchiha nodded, briefly obscured by a puff of smoke as he summoned his Anbu uniform. "Open," the commander ordered the Jonin. "Open the gates." The Jonin roared. Shinobi moved quickly as they pushed open the chain-linked gate, leaving it wide open. "Medics, prepare for casualties. Do not step over the line. Open the gate." Naruto was confused. He turned to the commander. "Why are we opening the gates? Aren't we under attack?" "No," the commander replied gruffly. "Runners are coming." The Jonin beside him took over for him. "Runners are refugees," the bald man said grimly. "Civilians, citizens, missing nin anybody who wants to escape from the land of water for a better life. They usually don't get far, not with the Kiri's hunter nin out there, but if they can make it this far, if they can make it past the yellow line, they're in Konoha's territory and they're safe." Naruto could see problems already. Wouldn't that make it very easy for Kiri to slip in an agent? "All of the runners are thoroughly debriefed," the bald man said. He looked out onto the field. "Sometimes we catch spies, sometimes they might slip through. Regardless, if Kiri lets 4 runners escape to try and plant a spy, that's 4 people we've saved." His voice softened, and he suddenly sounded very weary. "You have no idea what's about to come. We can't help," the commander continued hoarsely, his eyes fixed on the brightly lit lake bed. "If we cross that line, we're crossing the border. If we cross the border, we start a war. All we can do is make it as easy as possible for them to come to us," the bald Jonin commented quietly. "Incoming," somebody shouted from the sentry tower. 27 contacts inbound. Chakra presences indicate mostly civilians, maybe 3 distinct signatures are genin. "Come on," the commander muttered. "Make it to the line. Hunter nins incoming." The sentry shouted out again. "Runners are approaching the lake bed. Adjust the lights, and up the intensity," the bald Jonin shouted. "Shine 'em right at the hunter nin." The light spilling from the floodlights grew brighter, and they refocused on something past the lake bed. The sentry, obviously a Hyuga, peered forward intently. They've slowed, he called. Runners are approaching the lake bed. Here they come, the commander murmured. Naruto watched, his face a careful mask of blankness, as a horde of men and women emerged from the twisted trees at the other end of the dried lake bed. Some of them carried children, and others pulled at each other's hands to pull them along. They were screaming and hollering, waving their hands desperately to the outpost. Come to us. A voice blared out on the loudspeaker. Run as fast as you can. You're almost there. Come to us as quickly as possible. Blurs of black appeared behind them, and an elderly man in the back went down with a sudden scream and a spray of blood. Several of the runners turned their heads, and some screamed in fear, as two hunter nin appeared. They each wore white masks and dark robes, and carried blades. One of them stood up from the corpse of the old man, and then they blurred, disappearing in quick movements as they hunted down the runners. Run. Drop your luggage. Bring nothing but yourselves. Run to us. The loudspeaker continued, more urgent than before. The two hunter nin darted towards the runners, and a young girl, no older than Naruto, turned. She yelled something over her shoulder as she gestured for them to all run. Naruto gritted his teeth as he watched the Kunoichi, obviously a genin, launch herself at the hunter nin. A water technique rose up around her, shooting towards the assassins, but it was easily dodged. The girl jumped backwards and dove to the side, avoiding something that was thrown at her, but she was too slow to avoid the second hunter's sword. An arc of blood sprayed into the air and she screamed in agony, a noise cut off with a gurgling hiss as steel was lodged in her throat. The other hunter nin was making hand seal. The masked head reared back and a thin, yet powerful, stream of water shot out at the runners. It struck the ground, tearing through it, and rose up to slice through the backs of the fleeing men and women. 4 of them went down, some screaming as limbs were severed, others already dead. He saw a mother holding a newborn to her chest collapse, the lower half of her body gone, and the baby began to cry. Sasuke had had enough. His Sharingan was blazing, spinning wildly in his sockets, and his breathing was harsh. Perhaps what he was seeing was bringing back old memories, or perhaps the injustice of it all had gotten to him, but he took a step forward meaning to go past the line. Naruto gripped his cloak and yanked him back into line. The Uchiha whirled on him, his face contorted in anger, but it froze when he saw his captain's face. Naruto was deathly still, and his face was white with repressed rage. Most of it wasn't overly obvious, but his lips were twitching, his hands were clenched, and the look in his eyes was enough to pierce Sasuke's bubble as he looked past the Uchiha, regarding the massacre before them in silence. One by one, the runners were cut down as they tried to escape. Some made it closer than others. A small family got within 10 or so meters of range before the hunter nin got to them. The father whirled around, screaming incoherently as he swung a rusty iron bar with all of his might, but it was sliced in two and his stomach was torn open an instant later. The mother made it a few more meters before Senbon pierced her leg, and she collapsed, screaming agony and clutching at her leg. The 2 children she had been clutching fell out of her arms, a toddler and a small boy no older than 7. They were all crying. The commander let out a resigned sigh, and the bald jonin looked pained, closing his eyes and looking away. Please. The mother shrieked, holding up a bloodied hand towards the leaf nin. Please, help us. The oldest of the children crawled their way, closing the gap between the 2 lands inch by inch, but the boy was slow and stuck in the mud. The hunter nin approached the small family leisurely, the urgency gone now that most of their targets were down. At this range, Naruto could see that it was a female. Her mask was filled with tiny little tally marks, scrawled over every open surface, and Naruto abruptly realized that that was how many people that this operative had killed. Her partner stayed behind her, ruthlessly cutting down any of the wounded survivors. In the distance, he raised his sword and swung it down at something, and the cries of the baby abruptly went silent. I beg you, the mother was weeping. She turned back and to face her executioner, sobbing. Please, mercy, spare my children, the line's right there, just let them crawl over, kill me, but let 'em over. The hunter nin didn't even turn to look at the woman as she walked past. It was as if the sobbing, begging mother was just another piece of the landscape for all the attention the hunter nin gave her. Her attention was focused on the runner closest to the border, showing little concern that there were enemy shinobi less than 10 meters away either. Sasuke gritted his teeth, feeling warmth burning at the back of his eyes. Naruto had dropped his head, his eyes squeezed shut. His jaw trembled, and beneath his skin a furnace raged. For the first time since the battle against the false Jinchuriki, Naruto heard the chains rattling in his ears, stronger and louder than ever before. He was angry, truly, truly angry. Please, my children. No, don't. His eyes opened and his head shot up. The hunter Nin was 2 steps from the oldest boy, sword rising to deliver a fatal strike. Naruto's teeth clenched, and then with a sudden flare of chakra he swung out his arms. There was no hand seal or practiced technique to what he did. He reached deep within him, brushed past the horrible mental agony and seized those rusty, corroded chains in his hands. The sound of clanging, rattling metal filled the air as Naruto took that strange power and forced it from his tenketsu. It burned, it was almost as painful as the chakra of the 9-tailed demon fox, but he endured it as he lashed out with the chains. The hunter Nin was good, she was very good. She whipped her blade around and split one of the chains in half in an instant, the honed edge of her sword slicing through the corroded, barely usable chains. Broken links of metal fell to the ground, disappearing in wisps of violet smoke, but more chains lashed out and the hunter Nin was pushed back. They wrapped around the boy, snaked around the toddler and made for the mother. But then her partner was there and together they shattered each of the chains that Naruto sent, stopping the rescue. Naruto clenched his fist and pulled, and the chains came flying back, wrapped around 2 small bundles. They passed the yellow line and tumbled to the ground as Naruto lost control of his technique, the chains shattering and breaking apart in a shower of purple light. Nonetheless, he had done it, and the 2 children were safe. They were instantly scooped up by the awaiting medical squad, even as the rest of the Leaf Nin turned to Naruto in horror. The commander clenched his fist and the bald Jonin looked furious, but Naruto ignored him as he strode towards the yellow line. On the other side, the female hunter Nin was doing the same thing, and they came face to face, separated only by a single line of paint. Naruto stared at her mask, willing his eyes to see past it, aiming right where her eyes would be. The woman, on the other hand, showed emotion for the first time. She gave off the air of somebody who was annoyed. That was not your jurisdiction, she said coolly. Return the criminals. I made it my jurisdiction, Naruto responded sharply. And if you want them, then come and take them. He took a deep breath, folded multiple layers of chakra in and let the suppressed power leak from his tenketsu. The air around him shimmered and the ground beneath his feet groaned and cracked. He leaned forward, moving his face right against her mask, his blue eyes narrowed. Come on, cross the line. I fucking dare you. The hunter Nin didn't flinch at the show of restrained power, but her body language certainly indicated that she was more wary, and her partner behind her had taken position, ready for combat. For a few moments, it was uncertain what would happen. It would have been foolish for the hunter Nin to attack. There were clearly more Leaf Nin than Kiri Nin, but the woman didn't seem to care. Then, she took a step backwards and sheathed her sword. She turned to her partner and swiped a finger against her throat. The mother, still bleeding and wounded on the ground, looked up at Naruto with such gratefulness. Thank you, she wept. Thank you so much. She was cut off as the second hunter Nin calmly executed her. The first motion to her partner and they disappeared in a flicker of movement, leaving behind nothing but a spray of water and a field of corpses. The commander sagged and the bald Jonin heaved a sigh of relief. The graying man turned to Naruto, eyeing him sternly, but there was a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Don't worry, Naruto interrupted him before he could say anything. He's kept his eyes out on the field. I'll take full responsibility. The commander nodded. I know you will, he said gruffly. He paused, and then clapped Naruto on the shoulder. We don't often get to save a runner. It's a good feeling. He turned and hobbled off. What? Sasuke was panting, his Sharingan still swirling. His fists had clenched so hard that small droplets blood dripped to the ground. What was that? The bald Jonin snorted humorlessly. That, he echoed. That was life at the wall. He clapped Sasuke roughly on the back. Go home, kid, and never come back to this hellhole. He turned and left, leaving the 2 members of Team Sigma staring out at the field of corpses. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.